an idea that's coming through it, and not only does it receive the idea, even the combination of letters is not derived from speech itself. It's forged by chokhmah, a power of chokhmah, right? So it's an entirely a makabel. And therefore we are curious as to how, and we're going to start with this, we left off in like a question yesterday, how is it possible that if it's merely a makabel, it's able to have a greater koach than its own source, which we see that it can actually amplify the emotion, or it can amplify the intelligence. You guys okay over there? All right. It's all good. Does everyone understand the introduction, the review? Any questions?
So is it not the power of speech is strong? Like the higher level?
In those two things.
The power of speech itself?
We'll see. Right? Let's take a look. Let's start with page Hey on the top, the second paragraph on the page. Mikol Makom, nevertheless, anu roim, sheyesh tosefes or ba'aseichol b'islav shuso ba'osios hadibur. This is the answer to your question right off the top. We see that there is an additional light of intellect when it gets enclosed into the letters of speech. It shouldn't be, right? Because speech is just taking orders. And all of a sudden, the guy who takes the orders amplifies the commander of those orders, right? That the intelligence that goes, when it gets specifically enclosed into the speech, there's more light of intellect. From before it got revealed, right? When it was in a concealed state, just sort of tucked into the mind, it hadn't come into the letters of thought, maybe it certainly hadn't come into the letters of speech. It wasn't as brilliant of an idea as when it comes out of the speech. Here, Elias, we got you a book. Here you go. Hare kol davar seichel v'chochma sheba min makar ha-seichel b'medida b'hagbala b'shir hamshachaso b'orech rocha v'omek. Translation: every intellectual thing or wisdom, when it comes from the source of intellect in a measured and limited way, bashir hamshachaso, with a certain measure to how much is drawn out, in the three basic categories, what we call orech roch, which means length, width, and depth. In other words, every idea, when it comes out, what's length, width, and depth? It's kind of a metaphor for a river. We call it sometimes the river of Bina. Right, whenever you get out from the Chokhmah, which is called sometimes the wellspring of that river, right, this point, this unseen point, it then surfaces and reveals itself in a certain measure based on the strength of that wellspring, how long, wide, and deep the river is going to be. So whenever an idea comes out, it's going to come out in those particularly measured ways. Ba'ofen giloy, ba'ofen kach v'kach davka. As it shows itself, it's going to show itself in such and such a way. Because Shabbat b'dibor anu roin b'chush. He says this is something that we can sort of just see with our physical senses. You can identify this in examples in your life. Sha'az yisrachev haseichel harbeh. That when it actually gets said, the intellect broadens itself tremendously. V'archava yisera harbeh mikemo shaya kodem. In a much more broad way than it was before you actually said it. At the time when it actually was first revealed from the intellect, right? So when the thoughts are being formed in your mind, right? It's a little bit distracting. When the thoughts are being formed in your mind, right? Before you actually utter those words, it's in a certain measure, and then when the words come out, somehow there is this increase in light, increase in the intellect. Umin machshava eladibor, right? That basically be'eshin is galim min haseichel ba'osios machshava min machshava eladibor. When it gets into speech, it gets increased. Haya mitzumtzam b'mida b'gvul, because then in your mind it was contracted in a certain measured way. V'kan dafka k'shabal ledibor misrachev barchav yisera. And only here specifically, when it comes out in your speech, it gets broadened with extra breath. B'riboy pratim, And where do we see the actual evidence of this? There's more details. In other words, there's like a stream of details that you did not, so to speak, prepare inside the mind when you were hatching this idea. Means aspos uboin be'ein aruch, and extensions, which he actually says the word ein aruch. It's incomparably more detailed and expressed when it comes into speech, as it was first in your mind, when you had it only in your mind. Which you can basically see if you've ever tried to give sort of like a speech or prepare something, you can sort of wrap it all up and you have the thing in a few minutes in your mind. You can go through the whole thing. When it comes to actually saying it, somehow you have all this extra information and details when you actually come to the mouth, right, for some reason.
I think there's a significant benefit to verbalizing your thoughts.
You can call it a benefit, yeah, but it's not just that he's saying there's a benefit. He's saying that he's marveling at the seeming, incomprehensibility of that. Because what is speech at the end of the day? We just got through saying it has nothing of its own, right? It's just a receiver, both of the information and even the combination of letters, like everything about it, it's just receiving from what's above. In other words, all that it is, it received from its betters, which is like say Chokhmah Bina or the Midos. And now somehow it produces something that wasn't there before. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't have anything to enable it to produce something more than what it received. It's just a receiver.
It could be that you're being forced to say it you verbalize it, and so it can't just sort of be something that's in theory. It actually has to make sense. So you're forced to.
Well, it could very much make sense in your mind. There's no reason that it doesn't have to make sense in your mind. It could be a brilliant strategist, and he's got the whole strategy going. It's not that it doesn't make sense, and also no one's necessarily forcing him. But I hear what you're saying. You're taking it to the next level. Fine, but still, why would it all of a sudden increase if all you're doing is basically saying like, okay, I'll show it to you? Why does showing it to you like draw from some kind of a new level of light when the thing that's showing it to you is absence of any energy? It's just a receiver.
Feedback mechanism.
Oh, let's see what the Rebbe says.
Is this an attempted proof to say that maybe Deber is higher than Wichid?
Again, we're saying that it does something extra, but we don't understand why, because it shouldn't, right? It's merely, it has nothing of its own. How can it all of a sudden add something that it didn't receive? You can sit here if you want. V'kein kishaba or aseichel ba'osius hadibur. Also, when the light of intellect comes into speech, are you motze kamen yanim lalbish behem or seichel zeh? It suddenly like finds all types of ways to encloak this seichel ad shenimshach v'yored medrega lemedrega until it gets drawn down from level to level. Ad shegam bal seichel katan yachol lavin es seichel. To the point that even a inferior mind, so to speak, can experience this seichel. So in other words, you've sort of hatched this idea, you know what you want to say, but now you've come across a person that you want to influence, and they don't understand it the way you do. So now that you start speaking, suddenly through the agency of speech, you're able to bring the idea lower and lower and lower in order to enter it into this person's mind that would not have understood it the way you understood it. So if you would have sort of just transferred your thoughts into them, it would have been a no-go. But when you somehow put it into your speech finds new ways, finds new letters, and finds new inyanim, in other words, new mashalim, suddenly that you're able to put it into this lower mind. Gam imitachila kashinizgala haseichel, even though in the beginning, when this intellect was first revealed to the person himself, and it came to him in his letters of thought, so he had the concept already at a higher state. And not only did he have the concept as a higher state, in other words, he understood it himself, he also went as far as in his mind to come up with ways to explain it to the other person. So before the other person sort of enters the room, he's already thought of the idea the way he understands it. He's thought of methodologies to bring it down to this other person. right? And yet, when he actually faces this other person, new things come from the speech which enable it to suddenly actually go into the other person that he did not prepare yet. Lo matzah benavsho adayin derech eich u'mashi yachol lavi lemata mata biyoser. Even though he prepared how to bring it down to this person, he didn't find in his soul yet how to bring it down so low as he actually wound up doing when push came to shove and he actually revealed the idea. In other words, something happened where there was like this magic ability that the speech itself just increased the intelligence that is able to now come into this lower person. Ad shegam bal seichel katan yavinoso, to the point that this lower mind can now understand it. Ki'im lebali sichlim gedolim, right? When he understood it, and even when he prepared to say it to another person, it was still really only fit for a higher intelligence. Only when he speaks it comes out. Now afterwards, after he knows the idea and has decided to be able to share this idea, but only afterwards, in speech, at that moment of speech, there are renewed inside of him. They come out of nowhere, new inyanim, that are lower than the original ideas he had, even ideas to share the idea. Right? And that he can now bring this very seichel even lower. Turning the page. And through this, the light of the intelligence comes down. And this is what we call length. If you remember a second ago, we talked about length, width, and depth of an idea, right? The length of an idea is the ability to bring it to lower and lower and lower levels of intellect, right? So if you share your idea with like a chavrusa, someone who's on your level, it doesn't require a great amount of length. But if you're going to go and tell your idea to a young child who has just barely a little intellect, and you're able to bring it all the way down there, that's what we call the length of the idea. While we're at it, what's the depth of the idea? Right? It's not so of a stretch from just the simple meaning of the word, right? If the idea is really deep, it means it like you can plumb this, it's not a simple concept, right? It has a very, very deep meaning to it. That's the idea of like in the riverbed, however deep the riverbed is, that's going to be responsible for actually how wide and long it is. So the depth is sort of the source of how the width and the length are going to pan out, right? Because the deeper it is, then it's going to be wider and longer. But what's the width of an idea? This, by the way, is the basic discussion of a sefer called Shar HaYichud from the Mittler Rebbe. It starts with this, for many, many pages it goes on to this idea, and this is called the Keys to Chassidus. This book, the Shar HaYichud from the Mittler Rebbe, it's called the Mafteach to Chassidus. If you want to know Chassidus, so it starts over this idea. That's a whole other world to entertain, but at least this big intro, we should have a little idea what he's talking about, because he's quoting it here. So what's the width of an idea?
How many concepts it could move into?
How broad it is.
What does it mean to be a broad idea? Yeah.
It relates to a lot of different aspects.
Well, it covers, it applies to different things, it was like a lot of things to one.
Yeah, basically, it's like the idea of going to the right and to the left with an idea, is that it can basically develop many, many...
Connections to lots of different topics.
When you say, I would say connections to different topics. Again, when you're talking about the length, you're talking about whatever it is, just bringing it to a lower mind. When you're talking about the breadth, you're saying that it has all types of applications of how you could apply it and understand like different little, variations and degrees of the logic itself. And then you could take that whole logic and bring it down to lower and lower areas. What we're talking about right now is the length gets strengthened with the dibur. That suddenly, when you speak it out, you wind up suddenly miraculously being able to make it longer, i.e. go into a lower intellect. Right? So he's saying this is like a wonder. Where's the dibur get this power? And all of a sudden it can be revealed to a relatively low mind. V'odzos. Furthermore, shal yidei adibur dafka, that through the speech specifically, yischadshu etzlo sichlios chadashos betosefes or chadash be'amkus haseichel hazeh. Now what happens also is that when you speak, not only does it get longer and you can explain it to lower people, but the actual new ideas come out with an extra, what's called a new light of amkus. What's amkus? Depth. In other words, we know what depth is. It's like mamash, the person who thought of that didn't even realize how deep his own idea was until he started saying it to this person. So not only does he have the power through speech to tell a lower mind, he himself is like enlightened by the fact that he didn't himself realize how deep this own idea was until he started saying it. And again, this is something that I think most people can relate to, that actually happens to us, right? When you're like, that's why you get stimulated by an interesting conversation. You're stimulating yourself. Like you're developing what you thought you already knew, and all of a sudden you're finding out new things about an idea that you brought to the table to share. How all of a sudden, by just saying it, do you suddenly get excited by being enlightened by your own idea that you came to share in the first place? Yeah, no,
What about almost the opposite case, that somebody thinks they have a very clever, sophisticated idea, and then they articulate it, and then they realize they had a very dumb idea?
But even that, it's not that much different, because what you thought you had, right? That you, in other words, seemingly whatever you had in your mind, it's closer to you. It's right. What is saying it have the right to suddenly reveal that it's a dumb idea? It's the same thing. You like plumb the depth of this idea by saying it, and you're like, oh, it's not what I thought it was, right? So even that example happens, right? It's strange that speaking would bring that to your attention. You should have known that when it was inside of yourself, right?
Become more bittul, which is a bittul.
Why does speech, again, we established yesterday, a whole class, that it doesn't do anything. It doesn't produce the meaning, it doesn't produce the letters, and then suddenly it can lengthen the idea, it can deepen the idea only when you bring it to speech.
Is it sometimes like even speaking it out to yourself?
To a certain degree, yes. Obviously, you don't have that same quality of like entering a person's, like the length, so to speak, is entering it into another person's intellect who's lower than yours. So obviously, if you're speaking to yourself, you're stuck with your own intellect.
If that would be the case, there wouldn't be so much speech, it would be more like the idea of a shpad than the idea of the actual speech that's coming out.
Why? It's speech that does it.
Machshava.
No, makshava is, in other words, speaking to yourself is still different than thinking to yourself, 100%.
The exercise of speech is intellectually stimulating.
Which is strange because it's just a receiver. That's the whole point we're trying to make.
You're forced to bring it down, so that sort of stimulates that, and then it has a feedback probably of like giving you new ideas when you're speaking it.
You're saying a true thing, but why is the question? What is speech? What about speech, which again does not have anything of its own to bring to the table, suddenly makes this type of stimulation? We're going to see. Okay, so anyway, where do we leave off? So not only the length of the idea, but the depth of the idea is now broadened. Or chadash be'amkus haseichel hazeh ma shelo haya klal machshavaso levad, which somehow you did not realize when you yourself were thinking about this idea, how deep the idea was. Only when you said it. Hainu, kasher chashav es haseichel ba'osei hamachshava, which means that when you thought about this idea with letters of thought, kodem sheba ledibur, before it came out of your mouth, lo yadav lo iskil klal, you did not know and you didn't comprehend at all, but omek haseichel, you didn't realize how deep this idea was. Kamo ata be'es hadibur, as you do now at the moment of speech. Sha'az dafka nizgal lo omek haskala hazos. Only now, when you're speaking, do you suddenly realize how deep the idea is. This is what I was just thinking about when you said, "What is this true if you say it to yourself?" Yes, this is actually a reason why the commandment of Talmud Torah was dibarta bam. You have to say Torah out loud. You know, you're not allowed to learn Torah and sit there and just think Torah. It's not, you're allowed, but you're not doing the mitzvah of Talmud Torah.
Well, you are doing the mitzvah.
You're not doing the mitzvah of Talmud Torah.
But you're not doing the avera of not learning.
I said you don't have to, but you're not doing the mitzvah of Talmud.
It's not like
You're not doing the mitzvah of Talmud Torah unless you say it out of your mouth. Whatever you're doing good in other realms of your spirit, I'm not going to take it away from you. What you're not doing is the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. Why? You have to say it. It's a strange law, right? If Torah, and the job of Torah is to basically be misbon and understand, right? Unless you're learning, let's say Torah Shabbat, where it's not necessarily, the Indian is not necessarily to understand, right? Because it's just Kriya, and there's a certain level of divinity just in the letters themselves. When it comes to Torah Shabbat Peh, if you don't understand what you're learning when you learn Torah Shabbat Peh, there's really no Indian to do it. It's about understanding it. Just so everyone knows, if you're just going to sit there and read Dapim of Gemara and think you're doing a mitzvah without understanding it, you're not really doing a mitzvah. Torah Shabbat Peh, the mitzvah is to work your mind to understand. And the fact of the matter is, the Torah commands us, you must say it out of your mouth. And the reason is because you learn it better and you understand it better when you speak it. What's the difference? You would think almost the opposite. You would think like in quiet meditation and sort of simple, thought experiment, I would be able to, concentrate and focus my mind. What is my mouth helping me in this operation? It's just a external apparatus to just vocalize. What is the vocalization? Are we talking about ideas over here? And yet he's saying there's a mitzvah to learn out loud with your mouth, and the reason is because it aids you in your learning Torah. I mean, it's one of the reasons. There could be other mystical reasons. In terms of making adir b'tachtonim, Hashem wants us to actually use our lips, right? Because it's a physical action. But in addition to that, the idea of Talmud Torah is to understand the Torah, and strangely, you understand the Torah better when you say it out of your mouth. So even when you're sitting by yourself and learning Torah, you have to say it. For this reason. It's Torah Shabbat Peh, yes. L'chein tzrich lios limud Torah b'dibur davka, as it says, v'dibarta bam. That's talking about obviously all Torah, also Torah Shabbat Kasav, but Torah Shabbat Peh as well. B'kasiv chaim hem l'motzi'ehem b'peh. Right? So it's life for those who find them, it says regarding the Torah. And then the sages learned, don't learn it as those who find them, but those who take it out of your mouth. Because the word to find and to take out is very similar. So there's a pasuk in Mishlei, it says it's life for those who find it. And it says, don't read find it, it's life if you take it out of your mouth. It has to be said. The belamdo eza halacha, but only when you learn a certain. That's why the chavrusa concept is so prevalent and important, because you can't learn chavrusa quietly. If you learn by yourself, there's all kinds of accolades, and there's actually like sort of warnings about learning by yourself. It's because you don't necessarily say it out loud, and therefore you don't get the proper quality of Torah learning. When you learn it with a chavrusa, you're about it, and therefore it goes deeper inside of you. It has much more power. When you learn a halacha b'dibur dafka, specifically when you say it, suddenly you are blown away with new depth, specifically with your mouth. Which you would never find these things at all if you would just meditate in your thoughts alone without speech. It is peculiar. Right? Because mamish, you would think the opposite. Speech is just sort of like an annoying add-on to like seemingly the ikar, which is to think, right? But no, this is a peculiar thing. I think. Go ahead.
So would it be the same with learning from a Rav, just sitting there thinking about it, not actually getting what you need to, or is it because he's already giving it over, you're getting like a watered down version, like already a thought out version of the Torah? So it helps.
No, I mean you have to. When it comes to learning, there's a certain, give and take. Like at the time of the receiving from the Rav, you first have to know what the topic is. But then the idea is chazara. You have to go back and then learn it by yourself. In other words, you have to find the information at some level on your own. The idea of speaking it is after you have the concept, then you can say it. So you're not getting the mitzvah of Talmud Torah b'dibur when you're hearing it from the Rav. He is. But the point is, if you're a student and he's speaking, then you're getting his best intellect because he's speaking it.
I thought you also get the
You get the mitzvah of being in the Indian of Talmud Torah. I mean, it's obviously you're not using your mouth. We just said you have to learn Talmud Torah with your mouth. So when you speak out the Torah, this is obviously a greater advantage of just listening. But you can't do that until you know what to learn. So you have to hear from the Rav first and then.
Say someone gets his tongue chopped off or something. Is he not
Chas v'shalom.
on Talmud Torah?
He's is he chayiv in Talmud Torah? Obviously, he cannot. If you're saying if he can't speak,
Yeah, but something
is a mute. What's the story with the mute? I think he's still chayiv in Talmud Torah like, to the best of his abilities, but he loses that quality.
What's na'an?
Yeah. What's that?
What's na'an?
Me'ayin means like to meditate, to look into.
But someone like listens to Tanya share,
Yeah.
is it like he did Chitas Tanya that day?
He did it, but if he should really be speaking the words out. You should verbalize the words in order to properly do the mitzvah.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
The great faculty of speech is dafka, something that's super gashmi, the tongue, the lips.
Well, that's the thing that we're actually kind of hitting on, right? Remember, we started this conversation talking about the advantage of the drop of seed versus the mere speech. But now we're actually saying even the mere speech, right, has its own quality of being gashmi versus the intellect and the emotions. So even though the speech is not quite at the level of the drop, which is like super gashmi, but right, and similar, we had the similar question: why in the world would the person's essence specifically be found in this putrid drop, right? Versus like this like fantastic ability to orate and to be an orator and bring over clear and obvious wisdom. They don't see any clear and obvious wisdom in a putrid drop, and yet the putrid drop holds the essence. Same thing we're saying in a slightly different level, that the speech, which is nothing, it's like a putrid drop in the sense that it doesn't have anything of its own. It's not a progenitor of energy or intellect. It's just a receiver. It's nothing. And yet, why does it have this quality where it has greater seichel and it holds like more information and more quality, essential knowledge than when it's actually in the mind, the place of the knowledge. So it's Eliezer. That's exactly what we're getting at.
Is that different than writing?
Writing too has a quality of bringing even more so. You might say because there's the Indian of Maisa, which is even lower than Dibur. So obviously, the Indian of Torah Shebeksav has even like a sort of a greater power than Torah Shebal Peh in that sense, right? That it could, if it's written down, yeah, it brings it down even further, right? Obviously, each has a certain quality, but the Torah Shebeksav, in a certain sense, it has obviously a precedent at some level of the Torah Shebal Peh. Even though we like to often talk about the opposite, but you can't get around from the luchos of Evan. That is basically the essence of the Torah. It's dafka in a piece of stone, not in anyone's mouth, right? Okay, continuing. Also, sometimes in dibur specifically, in speech, ba or seichel b'kama ufanim shonim. Okay, by the way, this is now the width. Okay, we spoke about the length and the depth, and here is what it means, the width, which means when you speak, the idea can come out in kama ofanim shonim, which means many different manners. Like you come up with, different variations of the same idea. Like for example, because we didn't really totally nail this one down, but let's say when Moshe went up to Har Sinai, it says Hashem gave him 49 ways on every single halacha to see why it's puzzle or why it's kosher, why it's tameh, why it's tahor. Right? Why he's chayiv, why he's zakai. In other words, Moshe went up and he saw like the whole concept of, okay, it's tameh, but I'll show you 49 different ways to understand that it's tameh. I'll show you 49 different ways to understand that it's tahor. So that is called the width of an idea. What's that? The same thing. The same, exactly, right? This cup, is it kosher or not kosher? This chicken, is it a kosher shchit or not? Yes or no? Right, but if you want to widen this thing, I can show you 49 different reasons why yes and 49 reasons why no, right? Because that's what he saw all of them on both sides. So the point is that that wasn't a lesson in bringing it down and sharing it with a lower intellect. That's called the length, right? The width is like broadening the kama ofanim shonim, many different manners of how to understand the same thing. All of it, remember, is a product of the depth. The deeper the idea, the wider and longer it will go, right? But this is what he's talking about, the breadth of the idea, just because we never really totally understood it before. So he says, but in Dibur, also the width of the idea grows. He doesn't say those words here, but it's what he's basically saying. Kama ofanim shonu, shelo kamo shepetechilas gilu haseichel min hakoach hamaskil, which was not there. Those things were not there when he first hatched the seichel from what we call the koach hamaskil. Maybe take a seat. It's good. Join us, right? The koach. Let me ask you, what is the koach hamaskil? This is going to come up a lot. What is the koach hamaskil? Anyone heard of this before?
It's strength in the first
Mendel, what's the koach hamaskil? You got to chew first.
It's like the knowledge base.
What?
Yeah, and spheros, what is it?
The Kesser of Chachma.
That's exactly what it is. It's the Kesser of Chachma. Yeah, because it's, I know it's impressive, but it's a very, very well-tread topic. So anyone who's made their way a little bit through these waters will B'ezrat Hashem know this. So the idea is that let's understand what it means to be the Kesser of Chochmah. We don't just throw names around, right? Chochmah is like a haskala, right? It's basically, and Chochmah is like a seed, right? We talk about Chochmah as like a wellspring, it's like a point, it's a yud, it's like a seed, right? That pops into your head like a flash of lightning, sometimes we call it, right? You have a Chochmah flash. So it's not yet developed, it just sort of pops into your head, but Chochmah me'ayin timatzeh. It says that Chochmah comes from nowhere. It came out of nowhere. It doesn't actually come out of nowhere. It comes from sort of the source of all intellect, which we all sort of have some of an access to. And whenever you have an idea, it pops into your mind because the koach hamaskil, haskala is an idea. Maskil means to make an idea, right? So koach hamaskil means the idea maker, right? Which is basically, that's why it's called the Kesser. It's sort of like this, it's not Kesser proper, it's Kesser in Chochmah. That ideas, it's the hidden source of this drop that's going to pop into your head. It's called the koach hamaskil. Maskil is the one who makes thoughts, right? The mem in front is like a what is that? How do you explain that in English? It makes it happen, right?
Source.
Not the source. It comes from the doer, right? The active job of making intellect, to be maskil. So, fine. So let's see what we're saying here. That when you speak, and the idea comes out in all these different manners, as we just said, it's lo kamo b'techilas gilui. It's not as it was when it first got revealed in the seichel from the koach hamaskil, right? That when it popped into your mind from the source of all this variables and variation to it. Less a simple seed. Shaba el machshava umin machshava la dibor. Right now that it comes into the thoughts, letters of thought, and from thought to speech, shaba b'hagbala ba'ofen kach v'kach. Right, and it came in a certain very sort of standardized way, right? Because if it's a seed, that means it has sort of like a DNA. It has instructions. It has a certain methodology. In other words, it contains all of the hishtalshlus of what it's going to be in an organized way in your mind. Right? The idea comes and it comes with a package of delivery as it comes to your mind. But all of a sudden, achar kach b'dibur, this random, novelty happens. That even though it came down sort of like a plant. It just, it's going to have its trunk, it's going to have its branches, it's going to have its leaves, etc. All of a sudden, when it comes to dibur, mesigo so bekamu fanim shonim. All of a sudden, it grows things that were not there in the original blueprints. Right? Things come out of this idea that were not seemingly even in the source of the idea. That's what's peculiar about this. And that's the whole point of this. That's what doesn't make sense. If Dibur is just receiving, you can't all of a sudden have new things. And when you are going to suddenly speak, there's things that were not in the source of the idea. Even when it came out of the koach hamaskil. It's like the freshest idea straight from the source. It comes into your mind. It's all it needs, basically, seemingly, is just its natural course of development, right? You've got the seed. Just let's fertilize it. And all of a sudden, when you get to the end process, it produces things that were not even in the seed. Literally not even in the seed. How does that happen?
Isn't that how everything works in life?
Is that how everything works in life?
You take a seed, you plant it into the dirt, and then something that was like from the dirt, the power in the dirt, everything, the whole massive tree comes out. It's not in the actual seed, it's in the makabel, that's where all of it is.
But what we're saying is something that's, we can talk about the power of growth. It's a similar idea, but what we're talking about is the seed itself. It's going to go into, it's going to follow its directions, right? It has a certain intelligence inside of it. And it's going to develop. If it's an apple seed, it's going to turn into an apple tree. What we're basically saying is that you planted an apple tree, and now you've got oranges. Literally. It's not following the stages of development that were contained inside of it, even in its root. When you get to the end, it shows up as something else that was not in the origin itself.
It's more than its potential.
Yeah, it's more than its potential. In a few words, I think you wrapped it up right there. Yeah.
Is that like how it says in your Gemara, like the father gives like the whites of the eyes and the bones and this and that, and the woman produces like the other parts of the child's body? It's like there are things which wasn't even in the seed, which the fertilization and the incubation is creating essentially. Is that what they mean, like Gemara mean by that?
Yeah.
It wasn't even there in a hidden way.
You're saying because the flesh and the actual, the blood and the flesh was not in the seed. So it sort of came something else. Yeah, he is going to mention that mashal actually.
The Kayach Amasko thing,
Mm-hmm.
when you're speaking, couldn't you say that everything which you're going to get out of that was always there in a concealed way?
Not necessarily in the koach hamaskil, right? Maybe what we're saying is he's not talking about the koach hamaskil actually. He's talking about when it comes out of the koach hamaskil, when it becomes a piece of chokhmah. That's what he's challenging, that somehow something more was added to the chokhmah. So it could very well be that it's that thing that happens at the end in the aspect of dibur is that it's tapping into the koach hamaskil. So maybe it was there in potential there.
Is it not in the Chachma?
But it's not in the chokhmah. What he said when he mentioned the koach hamaskil, he was talking about when this idea comes fresh out of the koach hamaskil, then seemingly it should have all of its information. And yet when it comes to dibur, new things come out. So he's not negating that could be found in the koach hamaskil itself, although later he will negate that.
Isn't it like a constant feedback though? Because when you speak and like you're hearing it, as you're hearing it, like instantaneously, new thoughts are occurring to you based on what you're hearing. It's like a feedback loop kind of.
But what he's saying is he's not merely saying that when you hear yourself, you suddenly have a new idea. He's saying that when you speak, new ideas come out of your mouth right there. It's not just okay. You can also have a feedback loop. You can learn from the new information that you just taught yourself. But why are you teaching yourself new information just by speaking it? There shouldn't be such a thing as new information when it comes out of your mouth. Okay, if you want to then, fine, you learn from yourself. But that's already a second stage, the feedback loop. We're confused about how there's more information when I said it than there was when I thought it. Hainu.
Can't we say that there was always an information around at the beginning and the speech is just giva?
But that's what we've been saying before. If that was the case, the speech should not be able to amplify what it was before.
It's not. We're saying. I'm saying it's just, it was there before,
But it wasn't there before. We just got through saying there was a seed. You checked out the whole seed, right? And you opened up the thought of this seed, and you saw what was in there. Things are now coming out which were not in the seed. Hainu ba'ofen zeh ba'ofen acher. So he says basically, when you start to speak it, you understand it in many different ways, in this way and that way. U'mitzaref mechaber beis ofanim. Right? So now you bring out like sort of a new idea and another new idea, and then you connect those two new ideas. She'enam sosrim zeh lezeh. Right? And you realize that they don't contradict each other. Like while you're busy sort of reasoning with yourself or with someone else, you come up with an idea from your original, and then you come out with a seemingly an opposite idea, and then you're able to realize how those two ideas are not opposite, and then it's actually like a binding force. All this is while you're speaking. You didn't see this in your mind. Or these two things which are seemingly opposite, they don't sort of complement each other. You could actually get to the point where you realize that the shneim are davar echad, they're both one thing, and they only seem like opposites. All different types of variations of these chidushim. And why do you realize that they're really two things? Because you'll come to the point of realization that there's one nakuda that's obligating these two things. So as much as they seem oppositional when they come out, he's going into the details of what it looks like when you do this, that you might come up with two oppositional ideas. You may either synthesize them, or you may realize that they're really one idea, because there's one point which is actually generating the two of them. They only look contradictory when they express themselves, but you realize that they're actually two expressions of the same point. All this is going on in your speech. Hainu mitam hanal. From the reason that we said before, why did this all come out? When you say it, right? By the way, this is just happening while we're talking here, right? Because as we're speaking, someone comes with a question, and all of a sudden, it seems to contradict what we're saying, and then I have to come up with some kind of an answer. It's like, oh yeah, that didn't contradict. I didn't know that myself until you asked the question, and then we had to sort of speak it out and come to the resolution, right? If I knew the answer to your question to begin with, I would have explained it. The point is, as you ask a question and then you have to speak, suddenly you're deriving with your speech, if with any luck, a deeper idea from the speech, which incorporates the question and makes the question go away. Why did you have a question in the first place? Because as it was presented, the way you originally understand it, the depth of the idea did not incorporate such a question. It's all because the speech brings to the depth of the seichel. Shemesig as a seichel ba'omko pnimius. So only when you speak do you actually grasp the idea in its full depth and inwardness. Lechein haru masigu b'kamo ufanim shonim. That's why it gets broader, and you suddenly have all these new variations of the idea. And you can put these two different variations together and make little puzzles out of them and break new ideas out of them. All this is because the depth of the idea has now been brought to the surface only through speech. But and when it comes to the depth of the seichel, you don't have limitations. If it's a truly deep idea, if you can plumb to its depths, it's somewhat unlimited. And therefore, when you first brought it out, and it seemed like you ran up into a limitation, right? You see this in Chassidus all the time. The Rebbe starts every sikha by confusing you. He's saying, well, this idea leads to here, and this idea leads to here, and those two ideas don't work. So what do you have to do? You have to pull some deeper idea, which makes those two ideas actually be one idea, or makes them synthesize and perfectly make sense. So you're doing this yourself as you speak, because as you speak, you're plumbing to the depths of a seichel, which if you get there, it's so deep that it synthesizes all the seemingly contradictions, because the depths of the seichel doesn't have limitations. It can incorporate everything. Nimtza, let's wrap it up here. That dibur mamshich gilui or chadash. It comes out from all this somehow. We have to learn the mechanics of this. That the speech draws out a new light mimakar aseichel, from the very source of the seichel, which is the koach hamaskil, not the chokhmah, the koach hamaskil, and perhaps even deeper, as we're going to see, but at least the koach hamaskil. Ma shelo nizgal techila mimakar aseichel me'atzmo be'ez gile or aseichel mimakuro. It goes. This is a very important line. It sort of says it all. Speech draws out a new light from the source of intellect, which was not from the source of intellect itself when the light of the seichel first came out of its source. So when the light of the seichel first came out of its source, it produced one thing. As it gets down to the bottom, and it turns to speech, it goes back to the source of intellect, which did not come out the first time. Only when you speak do you sort of re-trigger the source of intellect. It's almost like you reinvigorate the entire idea only when you get to the bottom of it. V'gam be'iyun atov ba'omek machshavaso eino mizgale or omek haseichel. Even if you would mamish meditate quietly without speaking into the depths of this thought as much as you possibly could, it still would not reveal the depth of the intellect as it is, or the halacha as it is, only ki'im al yidei dibur dafka, only through speech. Very, very perplexing reality that we live every day. You can sit there and plummet to the depths of all depths. And as soon as you're going to speak it, something happens, it triggers the source of the idea, and a new light and a new depth, which opens up all kinds of new details, new avenues of resolution of those details and contradictions, which speech itself is responsible for. Yeah.
In this way, Rosh Hashanah, for example, we're encouraged to...
He actually brings that as well. Yes. This is what, that's right. He brings that example very soon. Why? Because Rosh Hashanah, you mamash have to have deep kavanas and do tshuva. And just like we're saying right now, we're talking all this time about intellect, right? But the same is true about emotion, right? If you want to love God, feel God, do tshuva later, you have, the words matter out loud. That's why, by the way, I really want to give everyone some kudos. Yesterday's davening was mamash great because you couldn't hear yourself hardly. Right? You should, if a shul is going well, look, if you're doing it bechitzonius, you're just like making noise, that's another thing. But if you're davening, you should hear yourself. And another guy around you should hear you. It's an inyan to bring it out of your mouth. It's because it says, what does it say? Kol ma'orer hakavana. There's literally a halacha which says your voice arouses your intention. So you could be sitting there all quiet doing your little, yichudim, but as soon as you use your voice, your intention gets stronger miraculously, basically. This is a strange science experiment. It doesn't really make sense, because what is deeper at the end of the day? It's nothing. You'll have to understand why it does. Grab your to the next.